Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
Hello. We have something a little different today. Both Deb and Joseph were unavailable to record, but we didn't want to miss a week, so the baton was passed to me. And I took this opportunity to invite Gary Clark on the podcast. I read Gary's most recent book. It's called Carl Jung and the Evolutionary Sciences. It came out in the fall of 2024. I read it right after it came out. And everyone I talked to, I said, I'm reading the most fabulous book. And I was so excited to get Gary on. So when we realized we had this slot, I was just really quick to email him, and he's been kind enough to join us from Australia, where it is very, very late. So, Gary, thank you for staying up for us. Gary Clark is currently a visiting research fellow in the School of Medical Sciences at the University of Adelaide in Australia. Since 2012, he's been a member of the school's Biological Anthropology and Comparative Anatomy unit. His research focus includes the evolution of music, paleoanthropology, and evolutionary approaches to analytical psychology. So thank you so much for joining us. And I wonder if we could start with you just telling us a little bit about your background, because it's really interesting.
Yeah. Although the books on evolutionary science and things like that, my original background or my original studies were in literature and poetry. I did my doctorate on Australian poetry and also music. So I had a interest in the arts, in literature and in music. And also reading Jung gave me a avenue into thinking about the arts and thinking about music from a scientific, an empirical and an evolutionary point of view. So when I was studying music, and when you're studying music, I was studying classical guitar. You spend many, many hours a day practicing, particularly leading up to exams. It might be 6 to 7, 8, sometimes 10 hours a day. And you can, on rare occasions, experience what they call flow states or altered states of consciousness. And there are a few quite special occasions where this happened, what researchers refer to as peak mystical experiences. I didn't quite know what happened when these experiences occurred when I was playing. They were a bit, they weren't something I was familiar with, but when I read up about them, I began to realise that these are things which commonly occur, particularly in indigenous cultures where they're cultivated purposely. And I began reading Jung, and I realised that what I experienced through music and art, through what I thought of as aesthetic experiences, that Jung spoke about in terms of the numinous, and that he had spent a lot of time researching these experiences throughout human history. So that was I was reading Jung as an undergraduate and neglecting my coursework and that sort of thing, because I gravitated towards this dimension of experience which Jung was so interested in.
Can I just ask there, because I'm curious if you would. I'm certainly curious about this, and I'm thinking our listeners might be too. So, just to recap, you're studying music. You have these intense experiences that you can't explain. This leads you to start looking into what the heck was that, and you find Jung, and it gives you a way of thinking about it. And the way I understand there are so many big ideas in your book, but one of the biggest ideas is about this kind of integration between the different brain systems that are characterized by these kinds of experiences. So I'm wondering, would you be able to tell us a little bit about this kind of mystical experience that you had while playing?
Yeah, sure. This was the one that was of pivotal importance was during a recital, and the hall that we gave our recitals in was a 19th century kind of Gothic style hall with very, very high rafters. And it was a 30-minute recital, and the hall's empty except for the examiners. So there's a lot of reverb and stuff like that, and there's not any other people there except for 3 or 4 people sitting at a table. But there were birds up in the rafters, way up high in the rafters, because it's this kind of Gothic ceiling, if you like. And about halfway through the recital, my sense of space and time kind of dissolved, and I felt like I had entered their souls, if you like, and entered their song. So when they were singing, I felt like I was coextensive with the song that they were making and coextensive with the birds. So the sense of an individualized identity had collapsed basically, and there was really no sense of time, no sense of space. But I was still playing, like it was like I was on autopilot and in this state of kind of transcendent euphoria. And then after the recital, I just had this kind of deep sense of well-being. And so that kind of alerted me to this other domain of experience that is not often accessed by people. But I was reading literature as well, so I could recognise this stuff in like Wordsworth's Ode to Immortality, and this dimension of experience was part of human culture. So that was a crucial experience. I had others performing that were not of such intensity, but that was the crucial one. But go on, sorry.
No, I was going to say, so you were an undergraduate when that happened.
Yes.
I'm just imagining you're 19, 20 years old, something like that, and that happens. And then I bet one is never quite the same after something like that.
I don't think you are,
Mhm.
because it gives you an insight into another dimension of existence. But I was, I went on to do a teaching degree, and then I studied literature and stuff like that. So as I write in the book, that experience in many ways kind of fell into the background of my awareness, and I tended to forget about it in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
But I still knew that was there. And it was only many years later when I started reading David Lewis Williams' book, Deciphering Ancient Minds, that I was able to make the connection between that experience and shamanism amongst like the Kung Bushmen in Africa, and link it to their the paintings that they do on the wall to depict states of shamanic trance and things. And he mentions in the book that when a shaman goes into trance, they will say that they become a bird or that they become an animal. And when I read that kind of clicked. I thought, this is what's going on. So that led to an interest in shamanism as well. But that was many years later and then I began to seriously investigate these issues from an evolutionary and neurobiological point of view, to understand them as a species typical phenomenon. These are not aberrant experiences really, although they may be for people in the West, but for the majority of cultures, these are kind of pivotal experiences that are highly valued.
Have you ever shared the same dream as someone you know? There are numerous accounts across cultures of people experiencing the same dream event. In many non-Western cultures, active communication through dreams is unquestioned and seen as fundamental to understanding the world. In New York in the 1960s and 70s, Montague Ullman and Stanley Krippner carried out experiments in dream telepathy. They reported numerous hits, although later researchers struggled to replicate their findings. This month, we are launching our own This Jungian Life experiment in dream telepathy. Each month, one of us will transmit an image we have studied in careful detail. You'll then tune in according to instructions we'll send by email and report back to us what you saw in your dreams. If you haven't signed up yet to join our experiment, the link is in the show notes or on our DreamWise book website. We're excited to test the possibilities of dream telepathy, and we hope you'll join us for our first transmission on the 25th of February. And I know you spent some time in Alice Springs, and I'm wondering if you could, where does that fit into this life narrative, and tell us about how that shaped your thinking as well?
Yeah, well, when I finished my music degree, or while I was doing my music degree, I was doing literature and music together. And then I went on to I did my honours in music and then a PhD, honours in literature, and a PhD in literature. And I was able to meet Les Murray, who was a famous Australian poet, recently passed away. But I decided to do my PhD on his poetry and a number of other Australian poets. And there was this tradition in Australian poetry going back to the 1930s where poets of European descent would start to try to link their poetry to the specific nature of our ecology and our weather systems. Like traditionally poetry coming from Europe and England, it's based on 4 seasons and the specific trees, oaks and all of those sorts of things. When people came to Australia, they tried to impose those aesthetic values on the continent, and it didn't work, mainly because in many parts of the continent we don't have 4 seasons. We have a wet and dry season, and it's just a completely different setup in terms of climate and weather and things like that. So there was this group of poets called the Jindi Warrabaks, and that's an Aboriginal word meaning to join together. And what they wanted to do was join together Euro-Australian forms of writing and poetry with indigenous culture and learn from indigenous culture and the indigenous attachment to place and spiritual conceptions of the ecology. And Les Murray was kind of a latter-day exponent of that aesthetic. And he'd read a lot of the masterworks in anthropology in Australia by T.G.H. Strello and A.P. Elkin. So I had a deep interest in anthropology while I was doing the PhD because of the importance of anthropology to our literary culture. And when I was finishing the PhD, I thought to myself, I'm reading a lot about Aboriginal culture from books, but I'm not really having any first-hand experience. So I decided to get a teaching diploma and go and teach in Central Australia and live amongst the communities that I was studying. And that led to over a decade of working with Indigenous communities out in the desert and in the city as well. And that's where I learned a lot about the culture and living. Probably Alice Springs, if people don't know what Alice Springs is, it's the town in the centre of Australia. It's a kind of the administrative hub of surrounding communities that are sometimes 600, 700, 800 kilometres away. So I was living deep in the desert, about 600 or 700 kilometres from Alice Springs. So we would go into Alice Springs of a weekend because that was where the pub was. They didn't have pubs on the communities because the communities are dry. So Alice Springs sort of became our weekend away, if you like, from communities. And a very long drive for a beer, 6 or 7 hours to have a beer. But that's what we did. So I spent a lot of time in Alice Springs, and then the link to Jung is that in Alice Springs around the turn of the 20th century and before World War I, crucial ethnographic work was done by Spencer and Gillen amongst the Aranda people, who are the Aboriginal people who live around Alice Springs. And I started to take an interest in this in this kind of cultural exchange between Aboriginal people and the European settlers, and how the European settlers learned a great deal from the Aboriginal people, and then they produced these seminal anthropological texts that actually influenced the trajectory of European thought. And Spencer and Gillen's work had a deep impact on Jung's thinking.
Yeah, that's one of the things that one of the many things I really was struck by in the book, is that you really trace how important anthropological thinking was to Jung. And in fact, I know that in Zurich, back in the day, people who were trained in Zurich at least a couple decades ago, one of the strains in training, we learn about dreams and alchemy and archetypal material and fairy tales and psychopathology and history and development. And in Zurich, at least a couple decades ago, another area of study was anthropology, and that is no longer part of the training of many Jungians. But it kind of feels like a missing piece in a way, in terms of here's how Jung, we sort of trace, here's how Jung was influenced by Gnosticism, here's how Jung was influenced by alchemy, but he was really quite influenced by what was known at the time about humans' ancient origins, which was not a lot, but what there was, he was really drawing upon, and also anthropology, especially the work of Spencer and Gillen. So I wasn't aware of that. It was really fascinating to see it. It made a lot of sense.
Yeah, well, that's right. And the reason, I don't know why you didn't have it pointed out to you as much, but there has been an attempt, what should I say? Early anthropology has been given a bad rap in recent decades. So, and sometimes for good reason. It was often the anthropologists, they kind of took on the racist assumptions of the colonial societies of which they were a part. So there's some things about early anthropology that are morally problematic for us today. A lot of the ideas in evolutionary thought and anthropology at the time ranked races according to brain size and intelligence. So there were reasons for people to reject it, but I think they ended up throwing the baby out with the bathwater and felt what they wanted to disassociate from this earlier tradition of anthropology, and that was the consensus for decades within anthropology itself. And I think Jungians were taking note of what was happening within the anthropological profession and thought, well, the anthropologists have decided that this stuff is all racist, therefore the anthropological thought that Jung based his ideas on is racist, therefore we have to disassociate Jungian psychology from the anthropological theories that Jung read and developed in his own way. I think that's only half the story. There's a few things that are important to note, is that amongst the society that they were living in, and particularly Francis Gillen, he was the postmaster at Alice Springs that collected a lot of the data and did a lot of the interviews with the Aranda people, who was working with Spencer, who was the actual academic. They were the most progressive members of their own society in a lot of cases, and they did a great deal to advance the cause of Indigenous Australians and to open the world of Indigenous Australians up to the broader Australian community and to the wider world. So there's a case to be made for the importance of their work in terms of them, not all the time, but particularly Francis Gillen, I think that's the case, and many other anthropologists were more progressive than the society around them, and they helped change the society and make it more progressive in terms of sympathy towards Indigenous worldviews and things like that. So I think it's, and there's also the issue that if you go back and read these works, and there's people like Howard Murphy. He's one of the anthropologists in Australia at the Australian National University, I think he's at now. And he thinks that these works are valuable, and they contain an immense body of data and insight that's borne out by more recent research, and that we should not neglect them. So I think on that basis, it's time to reconsider and value the anthropological basis of Jung's work, because it's crucial to his theories of human brain evolution.
Well, and I want to get you to talk about his theories of human brain evolution in just a second, but first I'll just say, there are parts of the collected works that really I think we all feel some discomfort with the way Jung kind of uses the term primitive or primitives to describe indigenous people, and there is a little bit of a tone in the way he talks about it, and it sort of can feel like a really ugly word, and yet I've always been aware that what Jung is saying, on the one hand, he does compare primitives with children, for example. That's something that comes up. But if you really listen to the point he's making, it's that indigenous cultures are in contact with something that we have lost contact with. And the whole gist of his opus, I think, is about how valuable that thing is and how much we need it. So on the one hand, it does sound very disparaging, and there is undoubted racism in the collected works. But I think the underlying idea there is what you describe, or the word that you use that I picked up on was integration. And it's the idea, which I hope we'll get into more as we go further into our discussion, about the different brain systems and how newer brain systems can cause us to become disassociated from these more ancient brain structures, and how problematic that is. And this is something that different lines of research, including Jung, have converged upon. So, but we'll hold off on that for just a minute. I hope we kind of work up to it, but let's go back to what you brought up about sort of the evolution of human consciousness, which of course is related. But what did Jung have to say about that, and what are your thoughts?
Okay, well, just to link it to what you said about Jung thinking that so-called primitive cultures are equivalent to children. His point was actually that dream consciousness is associated with affective or emotionally laden or evolutionarily ancient brain systems, and that children remain closer to that mode of consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
and that indigenous people cultivate it in their rituals. And it's like the Australian Aboriginal religious cosmology is called the dreaming, and it's called that for a very good reason, because they believe that access to this other domain of experience where the ancestors live, you can cross over from normal waking life into this other domain through dreams and also through ritual. So he objected strongly to the notion that ritual was a regression to an infantile mode of consciousness. He rejected Freud's association of ritual, or Freud's analysis of it in terms of the Oedipal complex. And he said that the rituals of primitive man are not those of a neurotic child, but the products of the fully grown adult. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Jung associating indigenous cultures, or what he called primitive cultures, with children, but he explicitly said he rejected the idea. Now, this this gets us into the issue of what's called the relationship between ontogeny and phylogeny.
Yes.
Which was the relationship between ontogeny and phylogeny. That's a idea that was very popular in 19th century Germany, popularized by Ernst Haeckel specifically. And there's the idea that ontogeny being the development of the individual human and phylogeny being the evolution of the species. And he said that there is a relationship between the two, which was called his biogenetic law. One of the relationships between development or ontogeny and phylogeny or evolution was the theory of recapitulation, that we go through the stages of our ancestors as we mature from an embryo through a child through to an adult. But this was only one manifestation of, or one aspect of his biogenetic law. Other aspects of it were what's called heterochrony, which is the changing of development. So you can extend development for a longer period of time. For example, you can grow your arms for a longer period of time and have longer arms or longer legs for running relative to other animals. That didn't involve the recapitulation of earlier species, but the extension of the growth trajectories of earlier or ancestral species. And Jung was aware of this. He said that to claim that the rituals of primitive humans were the same as a child, we know that, for example, fish go through the stage apparently of having gills as an embryo, and that's one of the things that Haeckel noted. But that does not mean that the adult form is the same as the embryonic form, because an adult fish is an adult fish. So when we're in that early stage, we're not like an embryo fish, we're like an adult fish. And he made the similar point about early humans, is that while there may be a relationship between ontogeny and phylogeny, early man or early humans were adults. They were not children. Mm-hmm. They were not stranded at an early stage of development. They were fully grown, which of course means that they're not children, and that the idea that he equated primitive cultures with children is actually a misreading of his work. Mm-hmm. But that idea has found its way into the Jungian scholarship, where Jungian scholars have said Jung thought primitive people were children. He used anthropology, which is racist. All of these ideas are part of the racism inherent in anthropology. Therefore, not only do we have to reject his interest in anthropology, we have to reject his interest in the relationship between ontogeny and phylogeny, because that also is racist. But the important thing with more recent research is that those theories, the relationship between ontogeny and phylogeny, and that tradition in German evolutionary thought, what's called the Naturphilosophen, or the nature philosophers, those kind of ideas which went back to Goethe and Haeckel developed, they've been confirmed by current research in developmental genetics and what's called evolutionary developmental biology, where researchers have found the genes that actually alter development and can change the rates of growth and the period of growth within a species, so that to get from an ancestral species to a descendant species, it's not necessarily genetic mutations, for example, that provide the necessary changes or variation, but you can speed up and slow down development for what are called regulatory genes, and that therefore changes in development or changes in ontogeny can give rise to new species. And this tradition, Evo Devo, or this new research program, Evo Devo, seeks to unite the old German biological tradition that Jung was influenced by with modern developmental genetics and embryology. So there's huge potential for looking or reconsidering Jung's work in the context of this research and having a more nuanced and subtle approach to these traditions out of which his ideas developed.
And what do you think some of the implications of that are?
Well, it highlights the degree to which our affinity with other animals.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of, for example, the evolution from chimpanzees to humans being the result of very dramatic change or a great deal of new genetic material, it can be a result of altering already existent structures, either anatomically or in the brain. So that evolution is conservative, and it tends to try and work with what's already there. The toolkit that's already there, it will try to work with it and use something which evolved for one purpose and then repurpose it for something else.
Right. It's called exaptation. Correct?
Exaptation, exactly. So that means that there's a great deal that humans share with other animals, and that the term for that in evolutionary biology is homology. It means that you have a similar brain structure or limb structure in one species, and you have a very similar structure in a distantly related species. The best example of it is the fins of fish, the wings of birds, and the hands of mammals and humans. All have a similar bone structure, but the length of each bone will be longer or shorter in the different species. So that's again the idea of altering development or ontogeny to create different species. But there's fundamental underlying homologies, and we share genes with flies and things like that, but things that have been conserved over millions and millions of years. That concept of homology, in my view, is really what the concept of archetypes is. And in the 19th century, Goethe was really one of the most famous exponents of the idea of underlying anatomical archetypes that are shared by a diverse range of species. And he developed that notion, and then other theorists took it on, and even Darwin was influenced by this idea that there are underlying archetypal structures shared by a diverse range of species. Darwin made the innovation of explaining these shared characteristics as being inherited from a common ancestor, and as the different species evolve, they alter, if you like, that underlying archetypal or homologous pattern. This is basically the fundamental idea at the heart of Jung's thinking, is that there was a relationship between ontogeny and phylogeny, and he made the inference from shared anatomical structures in the body to the brain and then to the psyche. But he also emphasized the fact that we bring with us not only the evolutionary history of humankind, but also the history of the primates and even earlier organisms. And this is based on the idea that we have these basic homologous or archetypal structures that we bring into current life. I've just got a quote here that I quote in the book, and this is from Jung speaking, and he said, "We keep forgetting that we are primates and that we have to make allowances for these primitive layers in our psyche." So that is an example of archetypes being not just human, really, but part of our primate and mammalian heritage.
Mm-hmm. And again, on a sort of feeling level, what that means is that we are deeply, deeply connected to all other life on the planet in this really kind of fundamental way, which we know, but maybe it has more to do with who we are, even as individuals, than we may think.
I think so. There's been a revolution in evolutionary thinking, mainly by Frans de Waal and other people like that, where there was a tendency in evolutionary biology to refrain from attributing human emotions to other species, that it was anthropomorphic. But Duval kind of turned that idea on its head, and he said the reason we have emotions that are similar to animals is
because we're
we are animals, and that of course we're going to notice similarities between human emotions and those of animals. And then you look at the work of Jaak Panksepp, and he was very interested in these homologous brain structures, and he showed that there are very homologous systems associated with maternal care and with pro-social emotions in humans that exist across species. So when I look at an elephant, I have an uncanny sense that this is a very human-like creature that just happens to walk on four legs and has a trunk. And that seems a bit of an odd thing to say, but the brain systems that an elephant possesses are very, very much like our own. So they have very similar systems in terms of social and maternal care. They exploit the similar system like the oxytocin system in maternal bonding. So there are all these things that unite us to the animal kingdom. And I think Jung understood that, to his credit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why encounters with animals can be so numinous, right? I mean, I think that idea that ascribing human emotions to animals, I think most pet owners know that that's nonsense. Like you know your dog has feelings. You know that, you know. And I agree. I think it's I just have a budgie, and it always strikes me just I mean, birds have a pretty intense attachment system. I don't know. It must be pretty neurobiologically different from a mammalian attachment system, but they have intense pair bonds, and there's a period where they're young, for many species of birds are entirely dependent on them. So, it's like, and that's the basis of the pet relationship, right? Is he's kind of bonded to me based on that. And so we share that, and we can sort of delight in each other every morning. And it's just, it is, I know what you're talking about. We recognize the sameness even among such different. I mean, obviously birds aren't even mammals, but there's something similar. There's something homologous there going on.
Well, just on the bird thing, it's we are similar to birds in certain ways, more so than other primates, and that's mainly got to do with vocal learning and musicality. So we have genes that are present in humans associated with vocal learning and musicality and language that are exist in birds but don't exist in chimpanzees.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Birds and that's how the young birds learn their song. Like they're not fixed action patterns where they have to learn it from the mothers. And they also use singing as a kind of, territorial chorus or for mate bonding. Just on that, it's interesting that Darwin proposed the idea that humans developed a form of musical proto-language before language evolved, and he based that theory on the idea that birds sing like humans and gibbons sing like humans, and that human communication was originally musical. And that makes sense because you see it in young children whose musical abilities in ontogeny develop before their language abilities, and they have very acute rhythm and melodic perception. And we speak to babies differently. We speak to them in a kind of melodic sing-song tone, what's called motherese.
Motherese, yeah.
So the musical aspect of humans is unique, and that's one of the reasons I'm interested in the evolution of music, is because I love music, and I think it's been neglected in evolutionary studies. Not so much recently. There's been a resurgence of research into the evolution of music, which is really a fascinating area.
Huh. That is really, really interesting. I want to see. Let me sort of lift up let's go to what I think of as sort of one of the maybe overarching ideas in the book. This fact that there are two different brain systems. One is more ancient, and the other is the neocortex. And they kind of work together somewhat uncomfortably. And the neocortex, which is higher brain functions, can get dissociated from the ancestral layer. And, this is something that Jung talks about repeatedly. He says it so clearly that the result of all psychopathology is being disconnected from what he called the 2 million-year-old man, the instinctual self. He says it over and over and over again in the collected works. And you find that same thing, and again, in these converging lines of research, the affective neuroscience kind of says something similar. You're coming at it also from the evolutionary basis, and then also there's some very interesting work being done around the use of psychedelics, ritual, these things that help essentially reintegrate these two brain structures. So I may have made a hash of that because this is so far above my pay grade, but maybe you can, if I did, you can restate it in a more accurate way.
Yeah, it might be helpful to link this to the idea of ontogeny and phylogeny to give it a broader evolutionary context for Jung's ideas of these two systems that become dissociated but ritual functions to integrate them. Human development is extended, and that humans grow up much more slowly than chimpanzees. For example, we have a childhood period of growth. We have an adolescent period of growth. Chimpanzees start reproducing around 8 years of age, whereas for humans it's delayed, and average age of reproduction for females is about 18 years of age, although obviously pregnancy can occur earlier. But it means that our life history is extended, and that adolescent period of growth and brain development is crucial because that's when you're given knowledge to become a member of your community. It's like a period of apprenticeship where you're taught the skills you need to become a productive member of your social group. So that's a really important developmental stage. And over evolutionary time, it seems that onset of sexual maturity and also the period of brain development is longer in human infants and children than in chimpanzees, and then sexual maturity occurs much later. So there's an extension of ontogeny, or a lengthening of ontogeny. And that's happened over evolutionary time, or phylogeny. So we have this development, or this extension of development. But what happens is that during development, there seems to be a kind of a transition that occurs during adolescence, a transition from subcortical affect or emotionally based brain systems to higher cortical brain systems as the conscious ego develops, and the default mode network and metacognition and prospection and all of these abilities that account for our kind of demographic expansion and success as a species,
Mm-hmm.
if you want to use that term.
Yeah.
But those kind of high executive abilities, which enable us to theory of mind, we're able to predict what others are thinking and infer what they're thinking. That will help us cooperate in collaborative groups if we're hunting. It'll help us teach the young people how to make tools for hunting, or how to learn all of these skills necessary for survival. So it produces what might be called a informational commons, as the word they use, and that you have a culture where you can store information and then pass that on to the next generation from down the generations. But the point is that this transition, as Jung noted, can actually, from what he would call an unconscious form of life to the emergence of consciousness in the ego, it can actually be traumatic or destabilize the psyche, and that it can actually be quite dangerous. So this is a period when you have high incidence, adolescence that is a period where you have high incidence of mental illness, in young people, and it seems to be a result of this emerging new brain system out of the more archaic archetypal brain system. What's the really interesting thing about this is that we know from comparative primatology and studies of hominin growth and development, hominins being all of our ancestors going back to chimpanzees, Homo erectus, the Australopithecines, the Neanderthals, all of these other human groups or species, is that as this period was extended, then the two brain systems would have possibly become discordant. But it seems that this process has been noted by cultures across the world, which is why they have adolescent initiation rites. And it seems that the purpose of the initiation rites is to manage this transition. And what the initiation rites tend to do, and this is where some of the neuroimaging from the psychedelics research highlights, is that during initiation rites, and particularly those where indigenous cultures use psychedelics, is it seems to deactivate these more recently evolved brain systems associated with metacognition, the default mode network, ego consciousness, and lead to a kind of upsurge, if you like, of these more ancient brain systems. And that's when people going through ritual may have experience altered state of consciousness. And by allowing these ancient brain systems to come to the surface, the conscious ego is able to reflect upon them and then integrate them, which is the kind of thing that Jung was talking about with individuation.
Right. I noted that you kind of equated this kind of integration with individuation, which I thought was a very kind of, to me, a new way of thinking about individuation. But I think that's essentially what he's talking about. The integration of the unconscious, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And he said that primitive ritual, or the rituals of primitive man, is the language that he used. He said that they were a primitive form of psychotherapy.
Yes. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I think this is borne out by a lot of the research in psychedelic neuroscience, where we can actually see by making the ego and advanced cognitive structures go offline, if you like, and bringing these more ancient systems into awareness, you can actually improve mental health dramatically.
You know, in part of my practice is working with parents whose kids are really struggling. Usually these are young adult kids, and when I sort of get the history, it's always like, well, I won't say it's always like this, but it's very often like, she was great, she was wonderful, everything was great until 13. You know, some story like that. And it's really impressed upon me in a kind of experiential way what you were just talking about, how, you know, it really is during adolescence that many of these mental health struggles first emerge. And I know there's some kind of speculation that it was the development of the neocortex that kind of left us uniquely susceptible to things like schizophrenia. That you don't really see schizophrenia among primates, among non-human primates.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's kind of the view that I tend to have, and I think it's a tragedy. It's a major tragedy that young people in our culture are not guided through this phase of development, and they may end up having excessive and unhealthy forms of cognitive rumination about their identity and about how other people see them, and all of these kind of problems associated with self-consciousness. And they may get stuck in those kind of ruminative patterns and negative thought patterns, which can pull them down into depression and all of those sorts of things. And we don't really have a cultural means by which young people can deal with these problems and integrate that self with the more archaic archetypal self.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we fail them massively. Indigenous cultures are really adept at doing this.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to lift that up because as I understood it, reading your book, and I thought this, yeah, so that the cultural, and I think this is not I think this is a pretty standard idea among anthropologists, but it was sort of new to me. See, you can tell me if I've got this right, that the cultural, the evolution of a kind of a cultural tool of, say, initiation rituals kind of arose in concert with these neuroanatomical changes and they kind of need to exist together. In other words, you kind of need to have adolescent rituals of initiation if you're going to have this more developed neocortex that sits on top of the more ancient brain system. So that the cultural thing arose in response to the physical changes as a way of kind of managing that and harmonizing it.
Yeah, I think so. But here's the really interesting thing, is that standard evolutionary theory and anthropologists generally who adopt an evolutionary perspective, they see ritual as an adaptation, so that it's something that merely evolved. There were genes for ritual that produced endorphins, and when people do rituals, like the Kung Bushmen have rituals, the endorphins are released, and that produces social bonding. So they argue that it's an adaptation. Robin Dunbar's kind of one of the prime examples of this orthodox conception of ritual. I find problems with that for the reason that rituals, and we know this from indigenous accounts of what they report happens during ritual, and fMRI studies of people taking psychedelics or entering altered states of consciousness. We know that these advanced cognitive brain systems associated with metacognition and all of these sorts of things that were responsible for our evolutionary success as kind of hunter-gatherers and being able to share information and theory of mind, those adaptations go offline. So if ritual is an adaptation, then why are they specifically designed to obviate the very brain systems that are responsible for our evolutionary success? So I find the orthodox explanation for ritual to be unconvincing. But here's the thing, Jung actually provides a better explanation, in my view, because he sees them as an attempt to integrate these two brain systems.
Yeah.
And which he wasn't actually engaging with modern evolutionary debates about the adaptive significance of ritual, but his idea that they're designed to integrate two potentially antagonistic brain systems actually accounts for the data much better than, for example, Robin Dunbar's explanation and the orthodox adaptationist accounts. So seeing ritual as a form of primitive psychotherapy, I think has a lot of potential to offer evolutionary researchers and neuroscientists and things like that.
And again, the point, the treatment is the integration of these two systems. I wonder if I can just read a quote from Panksepp and Bivin that you have in the book that it struck me for a couple of reasons. So you start off, as they write, such an approach seeks to illuminate how our most powerful emotional feelings, the primal emotional affects, arise from ancient neural networks situated in brain regions below the neocortical thinking cap. The neocortex is an organ that generates complex cognitive abilities as well as culture, and it is definitively important for complex perceptions, learning, and cognitions. The neocortex is responsible for almost all of the cultural milestones that human beings have been able to achieve. The cortex could achieve nothing without an evolved foundational mind deeper in the brain. Those ancient neural territories below the neocortex constitute our ancestral mind, the affective mind, which is evolutionarily specialized, and that we share with many other animals. It is archaeological treasure, for it contains the sources of some of our most powerful feelings. Those ancient subcortical brain systems are precious, multi-hued jewels, for anyone wishing to understand the roots of all the basic values we have ever known and will experience in our lives. The affects are the foundations upon which the beauty and ugliness of life has been constructed. So, first of all, I mean, and you point this out, it sounds so Jungian, what Panksepp is saying there. And he's really describing an experience of the numinous, that these multi-hued jewels, these profound experiences. That's exactly what Jung, I think, is talking about when he talks about numinosity. And so an experience of the numinous arises from the more ancient ancestral mind. And maybe what's important about a numinous experience and why Jung said it's the approach to the numinous that heals is because it is that moment of integration.
Yeah, that's right. Pans like that. If Jung was alive today, I think he could have very well written that. It's very resonant with his thinking. And there's also the metaphors of archaeological treasure, which from Jung's famous dream when he descended the levels of the house, he was going down into different archaeological layers of the psyche, which he equated with various historical stages. So there's affinities there as well as to like the archaeological layering of the mind. And they're very much of a piece, that comment and Jung's ideas. Panksepp did write an article. He passed away recently, but in 2017 he wrote an article with some colleagues saying that Jung's ideas were quite prescient and are convergent with modern studies in brain evolution and neuroscience.
So I'm going to change tracks a little bit here. Your book covers so much ground, and it's all related in this really fascinating way. There was a quote that you cite in the book from Abigail Tucker, who I guess is is she an anthropologist? I
think she's a popular science writer, but she did a lot of reading in the neurobiology of maternal emotion and attachment. She wrote a book called Mum Genes.
Oh, okay, great. So here's the quote. Mother love is the planet's original romance. What does that mean, and how do we understand that in relation to everything else we've been talking about?
Yeah, well, there's the idea that the first form of social bonding in mammals possibly became the basis of other forms of social life, particularly in humans. And the system that facilitates social bonding in mammals is the oxytocin system. And as an infant, and you'll find this in gorillas, in elephants, in mice, as the infant suckles at the breast, the hypothalamus will release oxytocin in the mother's brain and in the infant's brain. And it's those kind of pleasure-producing chemicals that establish the social bond. And we share those brain systems with other mammals, and that's why I think biologists would call them homologous, but I would say that we can call them archetypal because they're shared across species and they're shared across human cultures. So that provides a basis for understanding our affinity with other animals. But the difference with humans is we've repurposed those neurobiological substrates in other forms of social bonding. So, for example, during orgasm, males will have higher levels of oxytocin secreted in the brain, which will establish a bond with the partner that they've been with. And there's experiments in little prairie voles. They're a small little mammalian species, and the species that is pair bonded has upregulated oxytocin receptors, and the species that is solitary, that doesn't, the males don't bond with the females, they don't have that system upregulated. But also fathers, when they interact with their newborns, they will have upregulated oxytocin in their brain. So what seems to have occurred is what is essentially maternal nurturant neurobiology or neurochemistry in the human lineage over evolutionary time, that's been repurposed to establish paternal attachment to infants, or what we would call fatherhood. Now, the interesting thing about looking at Jung, he postulated that the male unconscious was feminine, that there was the anima that was below the more differentiated ego consciousness of the male, and that it was essentially feminine. This idea of repurposing the maternal neurobiology in male social psychology and male parenting behaviour suggests that some kind of support for Jung's idea of an unconscious feminine component in the male psyche. So that's one of the important ways I think we can start to think about his work, and it makes a lot of sense. It's supported by empirical data, and I think it's a fruitful way to approach Jung's ideas.
So the idea of anima and animus leading in there has been a somewhat controversial one in Jungian thought. But you make some points about perhaps a way of thinking about innate differences between males and females, and what this might mean psychologically. So what do you have to say about anima and animus?
Well, I think that like I said, I think there's a case to be made for a feminized kind of more nurturant aspect to the male psyche that's evolved, which would differentiate us from, say, chimpanzees and bonobos to a large degree. I know feminists have been critical of Jung's theory of an unconscious male component of the female psyche. I think there's evidence that males often, there'll be feminine figures in dreams and females male figures, so there may be a sexual attraction component. But the criticisms from feminists has been that any woman who seems to have an opinion or is a bit forthright is kind of under an animus obsession or possessed by an animus complex or something like that, which I can see their point, because I think female aggression exists. Evolutionary biologists call it lactational aggression. So females will often become aggressive when they have newborns, and you'll find this in other mammals. And that's a different type of aggression to males. So to call female assertiveness or female aggression, to call it a male behaviour, I'm sort of a bit sceptical of that. And that's where I kind of concede that I think the feminist critique has a point. What I tend to do more so is focus on Jung's conception of eros and logos, which is the male and female duality. And that has been critiqued quite a bit. But I think the critique is misguided. Jung was interested in differences between the sexes, and what he called a general observation that there are psychological differences between the sexes. Females may be more prone to relationship and kind of affective or emotional bonding, whereas males may be more involved in systematizing and different forms of cognition. This is all supported by most research in sex-based differences, experimental psychology, neuroscience. We know that there are average differences between the sexes. The distribution is bimodal, which means you have two kind of bell curves with an average difference. So there are average difference between the sexes, but there are areas of overlap. So you'll get a more feminine male, for example, and a more masculine female, or they're similar to the average of the opposite sex. Mm-hmm. But that's just an observation about variation. The average differences still exist, and you can see that in demographic data where they look at do psychological testing, job preferences, all of these things. And then when you look at the anthropological data, like all cultures have a sex-based division of labour, They have sex-based symbolism in their rituals, in their mythology. All of these things occur cross-culturally. And there's been a kind of tendency to attribute the sex binary to Western patriarchy or some kind of oppressive system that's developed in the West. That can't be the case because it exists in indigenous cultures. It exists in all the cultures that we know of.
It's universal. It's archetypal.
It's universal and it's archetypal, yeah. So basically the social constructionists and the Jungians who adopt the social constructionist perspective, arguing that the differences that we observe in our culture are due to enculturation and internalization of sexist stereotypes, all of that sort of thing. What they do is you can have an oppressive social system that oppresses women, for example, or that has sexist stereotypes. That cultural system may exploit biological differences between the sexes, but it did not create them. And this is the fundamental error in reasoning that the social constructionists make, is that the biological differences that are bodily based, they're associated with our reproductive biology, they exist prior to the cultural meanings that they can be inscribed, that our bodies are inscribed with. And those cultural meanings can be oppressive, but the cultural meanings don't create the biological sex differences. And the problem is you have a strand of Jungian thought, this social constructionist view of sex differences, and they deny any biological basis to differences between male and females. And it's a kind of a betrayal of Jung's legacy, because he sought to ground his ideas in evolutionary biology. Modern science knows that there are differences between the sexes, but Jungian scholarship has got itself into this unusual situation where it thinks that acknowledging biological differences between the sexes somehow gives succor to a conservative or reactionary ideology, and that this is what right-wing people do. And because they see themselves as left-wing or progressive, they seek to deny that there are any bodily-based or biologically-based differences between the sexes.
And to pick up on that, you said this sort of, you made this kind of strong assertion that it's a betrayal of Jung's legacy, but I think it's true, and I want to say why, is because one of the underlying ideas in Jung, this idea that goes to the archetypes and the collective unconscious, is that there is a universality to human experience. And actually, I don't see how you can have a psychology unless you believe that there's a kind of universality to what it means to be human. And in particular, linking it to the anthropology and the paleoanthropology is we're acknowledging our relationship with our ancestors who came before us, with other animals, with other mammals. And this is both, as you've said, true, but it's also healing. It's this acknowledgement of the universal that often helps us bear suffering, bear loss and grief, because we recognize that the experience is universal. There's something extraordinarily, deeply comforting about that, because that's the only way we can make meaning out of it, is if we recognize that it has a universal aspect to it. So to cut that off intellectually really leaves us adrift without being able to make these connections and without being able to make meaning.
Yeah, I think that's true. And my view is that there are universals. There are these sex-based universals, but they manifest themselves differently in different cultures. So there is the cultural differences, which we have to acknowledge. But I think there is, when you get to the deeper layers of the psyche, then you're going to find more and more affinity. And that's why you tend to see in ritual and altered states of consciousness where deeper archetypal brain systems seem to come to the surface, the imagery seems to be similar and the experiences are similar. And for example, the experience of the numinous that is cultivated in ritual in indigenous cultures and cross-culturally seems to be a universal experience. And the only way that could exist in geographically isolated areas is if there was a shared neurobiology underlying it. So when we talk about universals, there's many ways to approach it, but I'm partial to approaching it from the point of view of ritual life, altered states of consciousness, psychedelic neuroscience, and these kinds of things, which do show cross-cultural affinities quite plainly. And one of the problems with the modern West is we're a kind of outlier in terms of cultures globally, in that we don't tend to cultivate these domains of experience. So there's been a kind of splitting in the psyche. And this has occurred specifically since the Enlightenment, as Jung argued, that the age of reason and the emphasis on rational consciousness kind of split us off from these more archaic brain systems that were valued in earlier periods of history and valued by other cultures. The idea that modernity has kind of severed us, if you like, from these more numinous archetypal experiences, that was part of his critique of the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. So he was critiquing the European Enlightenment and its overemphasis on reason and rationality. The postmodernists and the social constructionists are also critiquing the Western Enlightenment, what they call Western modernity, and the growth of science and all of those sorts of things. The postmodernists and the social constructionists, and this applies to the post-Jungians who have been influenced by postmodernism, is they take Jung's critique of the Enlightenment and they accept that, his critique of Enlightenment rationalism, but then they don't accept his interest in science. So they reject science and they reject the scientific basis of Jung's thinking. Jung would have disagreed with them.
Yep.
Because Jung, while he was critical of the Enlightenment and he saw that a kind of dissociation occurred between archetypal experience and the rational conscious mind, he didn't believe that that means we abandon the Enlightenment project. What he wanted to do is he wanted to use the tools of science, research in anthropology, research in paleoanthropology, to provide an evolutionary critique of that very dissociation that the Enlightenment and science produced. So there's this kind of paradox in Jung's thinking where he was very, very critical of the scientific and rationalistic outlook, but he wanted to use that same very scientific outlook and approach, an empirically based scientific approach, to critique the dissociation that developed in our culture as a result of the Enlightenment and the consequent history. So he was very much in favour of science, in favour of empiricism, and the attempt of post-Jungians to deconstruct this aspect of his thinking and to kind of get rid of it, if you like, I think is a betrayal of his legacy, and it also deprives the broader community who's interested in evolutionary ideas and our ancient past. It deprives them of having a modern way to think about Jung in terms of contemporary research in the evolutionary sciences.
You know, in fact, in some ways, Jung's whole work was about trying to integrate the non-rational and the scientific.
Exactly.
And he had this sort of moment early in, as a young adult, trying to decide what field to go in. And he was choosing between medicine and I can't remember now what else. But he had the dream of the Radiolarian that said, you need to study medicine, you need to study science. And he was always trying to, be the empiricist to notice what he saw, but then sort of see if he could think about it scientifically without, as he said, he didn't want to explain it away. But he wanted to bring a scientific attitude to it. And of course, one of the most fruitful areas in which that occurred was his theory of synchronicity and his work with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli. So this was a lifelong orientation that Jung held of making room both for the scientific and the non-rational.
Absolutely. And that really is the basis of my attraction to Jung, because I could see he was making room for poetry. He was making room for music, for ritual, for aesthetic experience. But he was also an evolutionary empiricist. So he kind of brought the two sides of our kind of culture together and sought to synthesize them. I think, like, when you look at the Red Book, and he had his kind of confrontation with the unconscious, and he was doing these paintings and writing these texts out to accompany the paintings, he seems to have made a decision to not portray his experiences in a mode that was incomprehensible to his contemporaries. And his contemporaries understood the language of science. They understood empirical investigation. So he sought to make room for the experiences he had in the Red Book, but in terms of the language of modernity. He did not want to reject modernity. He did not want to reject the Enlightenment. He did not want to reject rationalism. He wanted to use those tools to understand the numinous dimensions of human experience. And that is really where the strength of his work lies, because as researchers now are getting a broader conception of human consciousness, looking at Eastern meditative practices, looking at indigenous shamanism, and then analysing altered states of consciousness, for example, subjects who have been given psychedelic compounds, they're able to empirically analyze and understand the deeper unconscious layers of the mind, but in a laboratory setting, and getting results that are able to be replicated and empirically verified. And the results are very much in accord with what Jung said about the nature of the unconscious.
Well, and of course, this approach that we've identified, where he wanted to keep hold of modernity and scientific inquiry and make room for the other thing, is exactly sort of put into practice what we've been talking about the integration of the neocortex and the older affective brain regions. So he was living that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's extremely important, because it's not only in academia and in Jungian studies that the what I'd call the epistemological nihilism of the postmodern approach has taken hold, but it's taken hold in broader society, where people are, in many ways, justifiably critiquing aspects of the West, of colonialism and various forms of oppression and things like that. But they're not really looking at the positives of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and how that enabled us to have medicine and overcome a lot of superstition and things like this. So you've got this polarity in the culture more broadly, but Jung's ideas provide a way in which we can bring these two sides of the culture together, and have a critical analysis of the Enlightenment and Western modernity and Enlightenment rationalism, while also utilising those tools in our understanding of history and culture and all of those sorts of things.
So it really is about, on a very profound level, a synthesis.
I think so. Yes. And not just. When people talk about individuation, they tend to talk about individuation as a process that the individual goes through, but I see it as a historical project, and that we are going through a process of individuation where science has kind of reached a place where it becomes over-rationalistic, and then it has to kind of use its tools to investigate how we lost those more ancient aspects of the mind, and reintegrate them culturally into our institutions, our educational institutions, our academic institutions.
I think we're in the territory of Ian McGilchrist and the Master and his Emissary.
Yeah, very, very much so. I think
Yeah.
Ian's work is great. I have a lot of sympathy for it.
Mm-hmm.
He tends to emphasize the hemispheres, and I tend to emphasize more recent secondary process brain systems and more archetypal brain systems. But the right hemisphere is more linked to subcortical brain systems,
interesting,
more involved in music and social emotion.
Right.
So there is a kind of component to the hemisphere theory that Ian talks about that I'm talking about in my book, and I think they really read together they would merge quite well. But they emphasize different aspects of a very similar phenomenon.
So if it's okay, there's a couple things that are hanging for me that I want to go back and pick up on and ask you about. One is, you were talking a minute ago about these kind of mystical experiences, ritual, psychedelic experiences, and how they all share something in common. And my question to you is, would you put dreaming in a similar category?
Absolutely. There's a fair bit of research on this. Robin Carhart-Harris, who was doing the neuroimaging with psychedelics and developing psychedelic therapies, and also Alan Hobson, who's probably among the world's premier dream researchers. He's a neuroscientist. And they both believe that mystical states and dreams are both reversions to primary process modes of thinking, which is exactly what Jung was saying, is that dream and ritual is a kind of regression to phylogenetically or evolutionarily ancient brain systems, or what we would now call primary process brain systems, as opposed to secondary process systems associated with ego consciousness. So I think there's also some people argue that there's a parallel with psychosis, that psychosis and dreams and rituals are kind of represent a similar kind of reversion to primary process systems.
Yeah, although it's interesting because I remember McGilchrist talks about psychosis being very typical of a sort of overly rigid left brain way of seeing the world. But the important thing I think about dreaming is like you said, is sort of akin to a mystical experience, is that if we're looking for this way to integrate, we have this gift that we wake up with every morning of this kind of experience of this archetypal brain that's been gifted to us in the form of images that we can seek to have a relationship with, and to bring our neocortical thinking function to these images as a way of possibly bringing about this integration, which I think is why dream work is so healing.
Absolutely. There's really interesting work that ayahuasca is a psychedelic that's taken by indigenous people in the Amazon, and when they take ayahuasca, it's a psychedelic like LSD or magic mushrooms, and they have rituals where the shamans sing, and when you take the ayahuasca, you experience very, very vivid and emotionally potent imagery. And you'll see whole scenes. If a person suffered from trauma, for example, they'll often see the events that cause the trauma, and by seeing them, be able to process them, and that's what brings the healing. But researchers have given people ayahuasca and then put them under an fMRI doing neuroimaging. And what they've found is when people are experiencing these visions under ayahuasca, that the posterior part of the brain, which is the visual region of the brain, information starts flowing forward from the visual region of the brain, and the more ancient subcortical, affective or emotionally based regions of the brain, what I would call the archetypal regions of the brain, there's information flowing upwards into awareness. So you get feed forward from the visual cortex, and you get feed upwards from these ancient emotional brain systems, which results in these emotionally potent forms of visual imagery. Now, when you look at Jung's Red Book, that's exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about emotionally potent forms of imagery. And in the book, I noticed the similarities between Jung's Red Book and the paintings of indigenous people in Peru, and they show very, similar kinds of patterns and very, very similar kinds of material. And I think it's because and Jung seemed to enter these ordered states of consciousness naturally. He, as far as we know, I don't think he was taking psychedelics, but his confrontation with the unconscious shows deep similarities with these emotionally potent hallucinations. Hallucination is probably the wrong word, but this emotionally potent visual imagery that's experienced during trance states.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can go on an ayahuasca quest. You can cultivate trance states, or you can just do dream work, or do you do all of them? But dream work is easily available. That's a wonderful thing about it. So, if I can go back and pick up on one other thing, we were talking before about Anima and Animus, maybe the feminist critique of the concept of the Animus has some legitimacy. But you said, but Eros and Logos really work. So could you just talk for a minute about maybe how you see that in terms of some of the stuff we've been talking about? And then how do you operationalize that concept in terms of Jungian psychology?
I see, for example, there's research that's been done by Simon Baron-Cohen, who is a researcher. He's actually the brother of Sacha Baron Cohen, who's Ali G. So Ali G's brother, or
Wow.
Bharat's brother. But he's a researcher in sex differences and autism research.
I didn't realize they were brothers. I've always thought, that's an unusual name, but yeah.
Interesting Christmas dinner at that family's house. So he's got a psychometric measure which he calls the empathy quotient, and females on average score much higher on the empathy quotient than males, and that would correspond to Jung's idea of eros as being a more feminine tendency associated with emotional relationship. What they found is males have a much more systematizing tendency. So they're much better at systematizing and the kind of associated things with maths and all of those kinds of qualities. But these are average differences. So it doesn't mean that males can only do the systematizing and females can only do the empathy. There's a lot of overlap, and females can do the systematizing, but the males that are good at it, there seems to be more of them. So the distribution is weighted towards males. And there's also evidence that females are just as good at some of these tasks, such as mathematics and things like that. They will do as well in school as the boys, but their interests are different. So females tend to have an interest for what is called animate objects or animate things, and males on average will have a preference for things. And this manifests itself in females, for example, in occupational situations where females tend to gravitate more towards psychology or the life sciences like biology and these kind of fields, where in the US now in universities, they're enrolling in these disciplines and far outperforming the males. But you get males on average tending more towards IT and engineering and these kinds of things. So, and Eric Newman actually, he said that logos is the systematizing power of the male brain that led to the evolution of Homo sapiens. And he associated it with logos or masculine consciousness. So I think I think there's a lot of support for these kind of average differences, what Jung called general differences. They are generally true, and Anthony Stevens said they're statistically valid in his analysis of these tendencies. But again, there's been a tendency in Jungian scholarship to reject the notion of eros and logos, that these are social constructs of an oppressive hegemonic Western patriarchy, and that all of the differences between males and females are socially constructed, and to say otherwise means you're a reactionary conservative. I don't really accept that. I don't take that argument seriously. And I think that the concept of eros and logos has a lot to recommend itself, particularly when you're looking at anthropology of hunter-gatherers, because they've not read any Foucault or Judith Butler. So thankfully, so they don't see sex differences between males and females as a social construct. They actually structure their kinship systems around it. Their symbolism is basically elaborations on biological differences between the males. You find a lot of feminine image or female-based imagery. For example, menstrual blood is considered to be the vital source of life and fertility. So people will use, in indigenous cultures, will use ochre to paint their bodies to symbolize fertility. So that female reproduction and female biology is actually elaborated at the symbolic and the ritual level in indigenous cultures. And you find similar kind of themes around male hunting and male-specific activities in indigenous cultures. So this idea that the concept of eros and logos is socially constructed, it's an idiosyncratically Western notion, which is ironic given these theorists claim to be deconstructing Western hegemony, yet they're just developing another Western ideology that other cultures would not share in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so I really appreciate all that, and maybe one way to sort of summarize it is that typically women are going to have easier access to so-called eros qualities, and men will have easier access to logos. And what Jung tells us is that it's very important to sort of develop the those qualities that are not sort of easily accessible. So, in terms of coming into psychological wholeness, so for men who are typically logos systematizing oriented, to develop their feeling function, and for women who may be more relationally oriented, just typically to lean into the kind of systematizing logos, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And Jung was at pains to emphasize that these are not necessarily qualities that are characteristic of the sexes. They are qualities which both sexes have,
right,
but they're
right.
differentiated to different degrees. And that, like you said, to cultivate the kind of contrasexual energies within the unconscious is kind of part of the process of individuation. So for a male to become more acquainted with the feminine dimension of existence is very important. We can see this in indigenous rituals. Often the symbolism of male initiation is that the young boys are buried in a kind of hole in the ground with leaves on it that represents a uterus, and they're symbolically reborn from childhood into adulthood as they go through the initiation rites. So there's all of this kind of female symbolism associated with uterine symbolism and blood symbolism in male ritual in indigenous cultures. So there seems to be a kind of an attempt to try and bring the masculine and feminine together through ritual life, which again, when you're looking at this stuff, Jung's ideas, it makes a lot of sense of the anthropological fieldwork.
Yeah, so it's certainly not that Jung is saying that women are a certain way and should be that way. It's not proscriptive. In fact, it's kind of the opposite. It's sort of saying, yeah, you might have a tendency to be this way. Your psychological task is to retain that, don't reject it, but also develop the other thing.
Yeah, that's right. And some women will have more logos than some men. Like,
sure.
There will be women who are particularly gender non-conforming. Women may identify more with male typical behaviours and social roles, and same with gender non-conforming males. So there's overlap, but these average differences are very pronounced, and it's kind of anti-intellectual to deny them.
Yes. And you were mentioning all the kind of cross-cultural research, just to say, and you mentioned this in your book, there's also evidence of these sex differences in primatology.
Exactly.
So again, the chimpanzees and the bonobos are not reading Judith Butler.
Exactly.
Right.
Like sex-based differences is part of organic life. Like it's everywhere. Flowers, animals, like you have sperm and you have ova. Like there's males and there's females. Like,
yeah, there it is. And it's a good thing to start with if we're going to understand some of this. So, we've been talking for a while, and we've really only just scratched the surface. There's so much in my notes we didn't even get to, but I feel like I should let you go because it's very late in Australia. But I want to close by saying one of the things that I find really moving about your work and your approach is that, so here you were, a young man, and you had this experience with the birds during your recital. And you maybe didn't do anything with it right away, but eventually what you've done is you've done exactly what Jung did, which is you've taken this mystical experience, you've honored it, and then you've brought a scientific understanding to it, not in a way to explain it away or to undo it, but to understand it more deeply. So I feel like you're really following in Jung's footsteps.
Well, I learned that lesson from him, that you don't reject the culture of modernity. You don't reject the culture that you live in. You try to understand these experiences in terms of your own culture. And I also want our scientific paradigms to be able to incorporate these dimensions of experience into our understanding of human psychology and human evolution. So, I love evolutionary studies. I love paleoanthropology. But I also think that the evolutionary sciences, it's getting better, but it tends not to acknowledge this domain of experience, what we call the numinous. So I think that is a kind of oversight of our scientific paradigms, and I would like to see them incorporate these kind of aspects of consciousness into our understanding of the mind. And I think Jung was 100 years ahead of his time in analysing these kind of phenomena and trying to provide an evolutionary explanation of them. And it seems now that only science is catching up with him.
Well, and thanks in good measure to you and your synthesizing approach. So the book is Carl Jung and the Evolutionary Sciences, A New Vision for Analytical Psychology by Gary Clark. Gary, is there a place where people can find you if they want to learn more about you?
I have ResearchGate. I have a lot of my published articles and the book and academia as well. And the books, you can buy the book from Routledge or Amazon or whatever.
Yeah, and it is such a delight. So it's wonderfully meaty, but it's also accessible. So I really highly recommend it. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us.
No worries.
Thanks for listening. To submit a dream, suggest an episode topic, or join our mailing list, visit our website, thisjungianlife.com. If you enjoyed this episode, give us 5 stars and a good review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure to click the notification bell to be alerted whenever we upload videos. And keep up with all things TJL by following us on Instagram, Facebook, X, and TikTok.